exhibit, which is overall a celebration of what I call the quest and the role of popular culture, but also the interplay of science, media, and also artifacts. And I'll end by identifying what I think is the basic drive, what fuels all of it, and what has fueled all of it for centuries, even centuries before what we typically call the space age. Let me just show you the exhibit. It is a 4-panel exhibit on the lower level, the main floor of the Zell. My goals going into it was to combine lots of different things, to combine comic books with science fiction pulps, to put books of popular science together with science fiction, to also combine science and art, artifacts and toys, really the everyday things that circulate, especially in the 20th century, in the 1950s and the 1960s. But my exhibit was also broader than just the 20th century, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. I do spend the majority of the exhibit celebrating popular culture in the 20th century, but there's a broader story that I'd like to tell, and I'll tell that tonight. First, I do want to overcome the central question of what's the point. There is still among certain academics, although it's changed a lot in the past 2 decades, there is a resistance to the study of some of this stuff. In many cases, popular culture or the artifacts of popular culture are either seen as kids' stuff or fantasy. And when it comes to looking at the space age, you'll see it quite often that scholars will focus on what they think are serious topics, things like Cold War politics, or the actual discoveries, the actual engineering accomplishments, the very serious stuff, whether it deals with the Cold War or NASA or some governmental institution. Often they very rarely focus on pop culture and some of the things that I'm going to look at tonight. But to me, this stuff is really, really important. It's really important because I see the space age that flourished in the 1950s and 1960s in some way as a consequence of media. And I'll have more to say about that. Sure, there were definite events that fueled other developments, things like Sputnik, the launch of a Soviet satellite. Nevertheless, we see this flourishing of popular culture, flourishing of imagination in the decades preceding Sputnik. And I think that's really interesting because I think it shows that media can not only help influence change or invention and innovation, but media can reflect popular hopes, popular dreams, our expectations of the future. So this stuff is really important to me as a scholar, and I'll attempt to show you why and to give you some key examples. Before I get there, though, let me state that traditionally the space age begins in 1957. This is how it's often framed. It begins with actual space flight, which is the launch of a Soviet satellite in 1957. When it ended, or if it has ended, is up for debate. And if anybody's curious about that, talk about that in the question and answer section. But usually traditional narratives of the space age begin with the shock of Sputnik. They follow the political fallout that followed, whether it was the damage to the Eisenhower administration or the rise of Johnson and Kennedy. There's a huge focus on some key consequences, whether that's increased funding to the National Science Foundation or the creation of the National Education Act, or even the creation of NASA. That's usually the story that's told. It's focused on big science, meaning government science, centralized science. It's usually a story that focuses on institutions, engineers, really the important people. But I think there's a much broader story here that I want to begin with before I really focus on the 1950s. And this is a quote that I'll share with you. It comes from a book called Rockets. This book became the textbook for educating millions of Americans about how rockets work, what the purpose of spaceflight was. This is a book that went through 21 editions and became a bestseller. And the author of the book in 1944 stated that what was going on here was really the story of a great dream. It wasn't something that began with an invention or began with a discovery. It was rather the story of a great dream, if you wish, which probably began many centuries ago on the islands off the coast of Greece. It's been dreamt again and again ever since. It's been dreamt all over the earth in places ranging from quiet libraries to noisy machine shops, and everyone who thought about that dream added a little knowledge. This is the quest. It's more than a theory, a discovery, or an invention, but it's rather a dream, an idea, but also a longing. It's also, in this view, a conceptual revolution, conceptual change. And what I mean by that is, I want to take just a moment to appreciate how far the human conceptual revolution in astronomy has come. What I'm going to show you here is a very crude representation of the Aristotelian universe. In one way or another, it was a vision of the universe that reigned supreme for about 2,000 years. There is one planet in this model, the Earth. The Earth is the bottom or the center of everything. Physics, all physics, accord with this model in which certain earthy material fall to the Earth, whereas other substances rise. The planets that you see were not thought of as other planets, but rather wandering lights. And the outer shell, the shell of, you might call this a great onion, the outer shell contained the fixed stars. So this was the universe of Aristotle. It had the Earth at the center, and it had a series of celestial spheres, and then an outer sphere of fixed stars. There was only, again, one planet. No way to get from one planet to another. Well, that would gradually change in a very slow process for hundreds of years. And I do want to be careful with this because this is not a major 17th century scientific revolution that happened instantly, but rather a very gradual change happened where initially a model of the universe that put the sun at the center and the Earth at the third spot was used as a model, and due to the various contributions of Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, and decades and decades, even centuries of debate, that model changed over time. For example, Galileo looked through his telescope at the moon, and he discovered that the moon was mountainous. Well, that contradicted the physics of the time. Galileo also looked at Jupiter and discovered moons. Well, there were vast implications there, because if Jupiter had moons the way that the Earth has a moon, it stood to reason that perhaps Jupiter could somehow be Earth-like, just as the moon was somehow Earth-like. And so this sets up a chain reaction of people adding more and more of a piece of evidence into the pot, but also more and more speculation over time throughout the 17th century into the 18th, and especially into the 19th century, where the universe begins to expand. The universe begins to expand not only with the discovery of other worlds or the conception of other worlds in our solar system, but also over time the idea that other stars might be suns of their own, and thus possibly have planets of their own. So I hope you can see how this is a huge conceptual change in thinking from a closed universe, a very small universe, to discovering an infinite universe, a universe possibly full of worlds. And you see big questions being asked, especially later in the 20th century, as people began to imagine aliens more and more, or alien invasions, or what first contact might be like. This is all part of the same story, the same quest for other worlds. And I think it's important to note that even going back as far as Galileo and others, there is a way that we can talk about the role of popular culture. For example, Galileo wrote The Starry Messenger, which was essentially a pamphlet. A pamphlet meant to change hands, to fuel debate, to make people discuss revolutionary ideas or discoveries. Kepler wrote science fiction as a way to popularize the model of Copernicus, to even imagine a moon that had inhabitants and creatures, and even intelligent beings. relativities, and all of this was part of what Kepler was doing. And even Newton wasn't a popularizer himself. You had to be very trained to even understand Newton. But Newton had popularizers that loved to spread his system of physics and his mathematics, particularly Voltaire and Voltaire's colleague and lover, Emily du Châtelet. They loved Newton. They worked to popularize Newton throughout France. And these are just 3 examples of a long history of popularizers, some would call them provocateurs, who argued their cases in the public, caused debates, caused controversies like the Galileo affair or other later controversies. I often tell my students that this is my key to understanding the history of science. The history of science is not just a series of discoveries or eureka moments or things that happen in a lab. The history of science is a history that happens in the public sphere. Often, those who succeed are very good writers, very good at arguing, at making the case, at provoking their enemies to falter. The history of science can be a history of these types of individuals, and that only gets more and more true as we move into the 19th century, where there's a massive expansion of not only space, but time. The age of the Earth, people are thinking bigger and bigger about the scale, the age, and the size of the cosmos. And throughout all of these debates and all of these provocations, there is a role that science fiction and fantasy play in helping people to explore the implications and to debate the ideas. So I think even going back as far as Galileo, there's a role for popular culture or the public sphere, and that would continue well into the 19th century, where you have an explosion of popular science books aimed at a general public, but also a corresponding explosion of science fiction. Often writers wrote both, or writers might take ideas from a science book and illustrate it in a fictional book. All of this was culminating in various public events and public debates, not only about the age of the Earth, but about evolution. And at least as far as the story for the quest for other worlds go, much of it culminated in the late 19th century with the discovery, what I call the discovery of Martians. I'm sure some of you are looking at me like I'm strange, but American astronomer Percival Lowell in the 1890s intricately charted what he called canals on Mars. And the theory went that what we were witnessing was evidence of an advanced irrigation system on Mars. Some people argue that Lowell was discredited among the astronomical community, but there's no doubt that he was not discredited when it came to popular culture. Many newspapers, many commentators, and the general public looked at this evidence of linear markings on the planet Mars, and really considered it as possible evidence for advanced Martians. This is something we could not do to our own planet, but it's something that was apparently done on the dying planet to irrigate a dying world. So this was an episode of Mars Mania. It led to new attempts to contact Mars through radio. It led lots of psychics to come out of the woodwork to say they had messages from Mars. And all of this Mars Mania was flourishing as new markets for cheaper books expanded, the rise of literacy continued to expand, and a new profession of science journalism began to occupy magazines, which were beginning to flourish in the late 19th century. Well, as we move into the 20th century, the quest for other worlds gets more interesting, beginning with the widespread celebration of the aviator, of the war ace, the aerial knight in the sky, that would transition flawlessly to images of astronauts or spaceship pilots. There was a very real way that the heroes of the early 20th century flew. They flew, they explored, they encountered great danger, they faced unknowns, they conquered their fears, they discovered new frontiers. That became the hero to a lot of readers of science fiction and popular culture. as Mars mania continued to flourish, but also as we get into the 1920s with the rise of the science fiction pulps. If anyone remembers these, they are the collection of mass-produced pulps that came out usually monthly. Most famously was Amazing Stories. There was also Astounding Science Fiction. And then by the 1930s, there was a whole host of other types of examples that included the words super, wonder, fantastic. One of those words in the title of a science fiction collection of stories. Then as we get into the 1920s again, there's the actual birth of rocketry, liquid fuel rockets as opposed to power rockets, which caused a very substantial fad in Weimar Germany, where they were attaching powder rockets to all kinds of automobiles, but also forming clubs, debating societies, writing science fiction, and also contributing to the premiere of a film called The Woman in the Moon. This film premiered in 1929 and depicted the first multi-stage liquid fuel rocket flight to the moon. And it's still an amazing scene, the launch scene. It's still amazing to watch today, considering it happened 40 years before Apollo. So as all of this starts to get going in the 20s and the 30s, the quest for other worlds is flourishing, but it's also flourishing amidst the flourishing of popular astronomy, which never receded in popularity like some of the other sciences in the late 19th century. Popular astronomy, along with natural history, would continue to flourish in popular culture even to today. And here's where we start to get into the 1940s and the 1950s. Due to the role of Willy Ray, if you have any questions about who this was, I've written the definitive biography, so I'll be happy to answer any questions. I'll give you some background. He was intimately involved in the Germans, in the Weimar scene, where he contributed mostly as a publicist, trying to excite the German public to believe in the future of Germans in space, to try to help get the rocket groups organized. And there were multiple books that tried to popularize rockets as the vehicle of the future. Well, after he immigrated from Nazi Germany in 1935, he wrote a few other books, and then he wrote Rockets, The Future of Travel Beyond the Stratosphere. This was the book I quoted earlier. It would eventually go through 21 editions, 4 revisions. It would become the book that science fiction authors consulted, juvenile audiences read, adult audiences referenced. It became America's textbook on rockets, and it came out about 6 months before the V2 rocket began to hit London. Lay's chief ambition here was, you could trace this all the way back to the motivations of Galileo or other writers, that he really thought that if he could excite the public, get them to believe in a future of human space travel, that the public could in turn serve as a patron. The public would buy his books, the public could fund experimentation. An excited public in a democracy could be the patron of a new frontier. And he truly believed that through the role of popularization, true science and true progress could follow. The next book that he put together that I showcase in the exhibit is called The Conquest of Space. It's actually a coffee table book. A coffee table book that became a bestseller due to the combination of Lay's text and the role of a Hollywood artist named Chesley Bonestell. Bonestell had been working on Hollywood films. He often painted backdrops for films like Citizen Kane, and he had an interest in astronomy. So he combined his interest in astronomy with his skill as a backdrop artist, and he worked with Lay to create this book that ranged from Lay's texts that put readers on the surface of the moon or into classrooms to learn about the future of space travel, and then to also witness through the artwork of Bonestell what space travel would be like, what it would look like. And more than many other books, this book was this book began a true explosion of the space age in the 1950s. Excuse me. First, I'll show you a few images from the book. These are not photographs. It's pretty amazing. These are paintings that were printed as black and white images. But they essentially gave Americans the first look at what the Earth might look like from space. And they were promoted as super realistic, scientifically feasible, and almost identical to what you might see in years to come from actual cameras. So those images are pretty amazing to me because they gave the American public the first glimpse of what the Earth would look like. They also included very dramatic, what I would call romantic landscapes. There's a long tradition in American art of landscape art that glorifies the wonders of nature, glorifies the complexities of the landscape, but also puts human beings in there, but very small. I don't know if you can see the astronauts. They're down at the bottom left. But it's a common feature of what romantic artists did in terms of making human beings feel a bit humble in face of the beauty and the terror of the cosmos. It also helps people to appreciate the complexities of nature. Here's another image. This is a depiction of Mars. See, the canals are still around. They're a little less artificial, but they're still very much around. For Bonestell and Lane, this was a very accurate and scientifically respectable way to represent Mars, and compared with what else was out there in popular culture, it was. As we get to the 1950s, the space age really does explode. It explodes in a whole host of different media, from radio, television, to Hollywood. Rockets were everywhere. As science fiction went mainstream, this is often called the golden age of science fiction. And I put just a few names of my favorite contributors to the golden age. But it really is an age where rockets began to be seen everywhere, even though rockets have not been innovated to a very significant degree. There is some work. There is some work down in New Mexico and then at Redstone. But overall, rockets are everywhere, but not photographs or imagined rockets. And this imagined future of rockets and space travel began to quickly flourish in television and in Hollywood. Hollywood usually held an advantage because TV still had to be taped live. I don't know if you can imagine what a science fiction program today might be like if it was taped live. But it wasn't the best quality. Nevertheless, one show in particular, Tom Corbett's Space Cadet, ran for 5 years. One of the longest running shows in the history of early television. And it had many competitors like Space Patrol and Captain Video and his Video Rangers. There were a lot of different programs trying to promote space travel, some of them aimed mostly for kids, but others gaining a wider audience. For example, Tom Corbett used Willie Ray as a science advisor. And then there are a whole host of other movies. Destination Moon is the most famous one. It's still a remarkable film to watch today. And there are other movies that I won't list off here, but they're up on the screen. Most of these films have drawn scholarly attention, especially the last 4. Scholars have put a lot of thought into explaining the rise of alien invasion movies, the invasion thrillers of the 1950s. They still often point to communism, fear of communist infiltration, fear of the alien other, or enemies among us to explain some of these invasion films. But I don't think they've really done enough to explain the non-invasion films, the ones that celebrate spaceflight and predict an immediate future of humans in space. I think there's a different story to tell about those. Here's just a couple pictures from Tom Corbett's Space Cadet. It was not only a television show, but a whole host of novels, kids' toys, costumes, decoder rings. You get Tom Corbett merchandise and cereal boxes. Tom Corbett was probably one of the most influential science fiction TV shows that we no longer talk about today. I'll also say a few words about the role of Collier's magazine. Collier's had a circulation of 3.1 million, even though it folded in the 1960s, which is why most of you probably have never heard of Collier's. But it ran in the early 50s an 8-part series. An 8-part series that used the paintings of Bonestel, the words of Ley, and introduced new characters like engineer Werner von Braun and others, and in article after article presented an immediate future of Americans in space. These were articles that offered all ingredients, the futurism, the hope, a little bit of the fear of Soviet competition, but the overall goal of the Collier series was to convince Americans that all of this was possible. With the right investment, with the right commitment, space travel would become an everyday reality for millions of Americans by the 1980s. Some of these articles are. This is often seen as a watershed moment for the cause of spaceflight, especially with the entrance of Werner von Braun into the scene. I'll just note that there are lots of other examples like Life or the Saturday Evening Post that ran spaceflight issues as well. And many of them used the artwork of Chesley Bonestel to promote it. What you're seeing here on the left is the journey to Mars, how we'll get to Mars. Notice there's still canals. The other one is the image of what the first American satellite was. In 1955, the Eisenhower administration pronounced that a satellite would be launched during the International Geophysical Year, and this is Collier's imagined American satellite of the future. Here's just a few other representations of the future. This is what a space station of the 1980s would be like. This was von Braun's favorite design of his rotating, I believe it was inflatable space station. And at the same time that these magazines began to flourish, you had other types of magazines flourishing with rockets on the covers, predictions of Americans in space by the year 1960, but also lots of articles that educated Americans on space technology, the future, science, how all of it was feasible. And immediately before Sputnik, there was a whole host of other books similar to The Conquest of Space that just began to flourish and flourish and flourish, while Ley continued to write similar books. So all this is happening right at the moment in time when probably the most influential person that you could hope for gets involved, and that's Walt Disney. Walt Disney was trying to come up with a scheme to finance the construction of Disneyland, and the park had 4 themes: Fantasyland, Adventureland, Tomorrowland, and Frontierland. Excuse me, Tomorrowland was the one that's important for us. So he decided perhaps he could fund the construction of Disneyland if he turned to television and a TV special. And eventually this created 3 different TV specials about space. The first one was titled Man in Space, then came one on the moon, and then one on Mars. More than any other program, this aided the cause of space flight advocacy, because it not only combined imaginative cartoons, illustrations of what flight around the Earth would look like, and flight to the moon would look like, but combined those animations with expert testing. This was not just a cartoon. This was a TV special where animator Ward Kimball would interview Dr. Werner von Braun and other experts, and then Disney would illustrate what they were trying to say. So it was at times serious, at times funny, but overall incredibly educational. Disney wanted it to be educational. And this program would be shown in schools for decades to come. after an initial broadcast in which it was viewed by 40 million viewers. It was also rerun over and over and over again. So this was a really influential program. It was advised by Lay, by Buckman, by the very people who were peddling the dreams, peddling the idea of space travel. And they also contributed to adaptations of the program. The program was adapted into comic books, into books that were put in for schools, and even feature films. This also created, at least at the spot of Disneyland, a way for Tomorrowland to focus on technology. And Tomorrowland did that by constructing the TWA Moonlighter, which is the tallest structure at Disneyland at the time. Disneyland also had a trip to the moon where American families could sit in their seats, look at a screen up above and a screen below, and they could watch the blueness of the sky transition to space while they saw the Earth below retreat and get smaller and smaller. I believe this eventually became the Michael Jackson ride, but I don't know what it is today. There was also a virtual space station that families could tour where they could look down upon the Earth. It was the same type of exhibit that flourished during the World's Fairs. During the World's Fairs, we could look down upon the city of the future. Well, in these exhibits, you could look down upon the Earth from the space station. So there's some virtual trips to the moon, some virtual trips to space stations in 1955 that inspired millions of Americans to dream, to participate, to partake in that voyage of discovery. Just a few images from the animated section of the film. And then here's a typical example of what the expert section would look like. Here's Werner von Braun selling his space station and his ship idea for a future convoy to Mars. He did that over and over again on these specials in an attempt to get the public interested, to excite them, and possibly lead to the creation of something like NASA. There's a few other examples. There's Disney's Man in Space comic books, there were toys. This was one of the best marketing successes that Walt Disney ever had in terms of financing Disneyland and profiting immensely off the hopes and dreams of not only children, but adults. Incidentally, Lay had his own models, which included passenger rockets and space taxis, while he wrote book after book aimed at juvenile audiences. These are where these folks, somewhat different from Galloway, because they began to target children. They began to think that the key to the future is in the young. If you can convince the young that this can be a reality, then you just ensured a generation of future patrons. I wonder if we could imagine if politicians would ever target our children that way, but it seemed to work for these scientific thinkers. So more and more books were produced. Lay wrote most of them, aimed at either audiences of adults or children, all of it attempting to sell space to the American public. Well, so what are the implications here? Well, prior to Sputnik, I hope to have shown you that the space age flourished in mass media. All of this is pre-Sputnik. It's pre-NASA, and it, in my opinion, shows really where the shock of Sputnik came from, because it reflects the cultural hopes, the cultural dreams, the expectations, the fantasies of the future that Americans were very much consuming, very willing to believe in, even though no one was yet paying the bill. And it did lead to the reaction to the launch of the Soviet satellite. Historians are somewhat divided on this. There are some historians that think the shock was a media overreaction. The American public didn't really freak out the way that the media portrayed the event. Whereas I kind of tend to argue that the media reflected a very real sentiment of outrage. Americans had been believing through mass media, through consumptions of mass media, that Americans would be first in space. There was very little discussion of the role of the Soviet Union. There was very little depictions of Soviets in space. It was all presented to them, packaged, sold as American accomplishments that were inevitable. So my take on the journalistic reactions and the consequences is that some of it is understandable. Journalists have a right to feel somewhat betrayed or a duty as citizen journalists to report on this event as a shock to the system. But I hope that I have told a larger story. I hope that I told something that is more than just Sputnik or the 50s, but that what drove most of this, perhaps what pushed it to its crescendo at a time when space travel finally became possible, was it had always been part of a broader quest for other worlds, a quest of discovery, a quest to explore new frontiers, to seek out the unknown, to discover what is possible. And all of that quest, at least this part of the quest, whether we're dealing with the 50s or other decades, is a part of the world that Galileo left for us. It reflects the broader hopes, our dreams, our expectations, but our broader need to explore. And here I want to be careful because there are scholars who will look at some of these images that I've shown you, and some of these images like the space pilot, and they will argue that, well, this is just an extension of the American frontier, it's an extension of manifest destiny, it's an extension, you can even argue, of Western imperialism, or other types of things that have been quite often condemned for many legitimate reasons. But I think if you put Lay or even myself in a corner, I would say, yeah, but there's still a story to celebrate. If you didn't have empires, if you didn't have networks of, if you didn't have imperial networks, if you didn't have states, you would still have this quest, this fundamental drive, this basic drive to go just beyond that line, or to discover the next frontier, to know the unknown, to face the dangers. I think that is what really motivates the quest and the quest for other worlds. And I think it's a story to celebrate. And I hope that my contribution to Galileo's world helps us to celebrate that fundamental quest, because that is what fuels science. And that is what fuels knowledge. That quest to know. And I wanted to end tonight with some commentary over a video. I'm going to show you the trailer for the 2014 Cosmos series. And I should say, as a historian of science, as most of the other historians of science I know, I'm not a big fan of this series. It gets a lot of the history wrong. But I am a fan of this trailer because I think this trailer reflects something very essential that was trying to be communicated regarding the quest for other worlds. It captures a spirit, a feeling, we might use the word zeitgeist, and I'm going to try to leave you with that source of inspiration as you go forth as students, scholars, and other explorers.
The cosmos is all it is, or ever was, or ever will be. Our contemplations of the cosmos stir us.
Scientifically, spiritually.
We know we are approaching the grandest of mysteries.
Who are we? What else is out there?
It's time to get going again.
So here's Neil deGrasse Tyson taking on a spaceship of the imagination, which is going to explore strange new worlds. It also interweaves outer worlds, our connections with nature, what else is out there. This is the journey that fuels the quest into the unknown, the quest into the frontier. And also, as we make this quest, we try to discover our connections to each other. This is a transcendental journey, a journey of knowledge, of aspirations, a journey of exploration through science, through appreciation of the cosmos, This is the human quest. It's part of a very long tradition of trying to attain enlightenment, trying to understand who we are, what is out there, just as earlier explorers had done similarly, just as other explorers had ventured, as other people have confronted the powers of nature or the night sky. Just asking the question of what will I see when I get there. This is about the human spirit. I think it's a story to celebrate. It's the same story in terms of cave or ancestors leaving caves, people boarding ships, people questing to know. That is the human condition. And as you make this journey in your lives, as you explore, you may confront powerful institutions. You may have to question the scale of time. You may have to confront God. And you have the science and you have the technology to make the quest. This is your cosmos. Explore. All right, thank you. I'll be happy to take any questions if someone can get the lights so I can see the hands. Yes.
I'm quite advanced with the cosmos, but I'm just curious about what inaccuracies. You mentioned that there's some error in science.
What inaccuracies in terms of what? I'm not sure I understand.
You mentioned that this show was once has some scientific inaccuracies.
Well, the history of science is often a history of inaccuracy.
Okay.
But it's, as any history of knowledge, does that help answer your question? I'm not sure if I understand. Yes.
I know, as basically, I do remember a lot of those books and all of those things that you did up. Was there a correlation or was in Europe, was there the same kind of popular culture using some of the fiction?
I think it would need more, I would need more research to confirm it, but I suspect the answer is yes. Although I would also suspect that media markets were a bit more lively in the New York-based area than in London. And certainly broadcast was a bit more lively in the United States. But the same books flourished back and forth across the Atlantic. Many of the key actors were British writers. And so there definitely was transatlantic communication networks going on. Germany in particular, Germany has always been really big on popular science.
Was there evidence of popular scientific fantasy in Russia prior to the study?
I'm sure there was. I know there's a book that's been written by scholar Asif Siddiqui that explores the Soviet context. He's much more of an expert than I am on the Soviet stuff, but there's definitely a flourishing. The Soviet system had latched onto rockets as a symbol from the very beginning. Rockets were the future. Bolshevism was seen as futuristic or pro-technology. So this was a way in which the state promoted rockets as a way to promote its own new identity as opposed to a full czarist regime. So the Soviet Union was much more receptive on a state level, I would say, than the United States or anywhere in Europe. Yes.
Talking about ladies' influence in Germany and stuff. Is it safe to say that if Germany's strong and been decimated by the Civil War and so many very Jewish
It's somewhat of a counterfactual question. In terms of, it's a much more hypothetical question. This is what I'm saying. You definitely see the excommunication of Jewish physicists, right, as you said. And then with Germany losing the war, there was a migration of those rocket scientists, those rocket engineers to the United States. If Germany had won the war, I'm sure they probably would have come. And then whether or not that would lead to one thing or another, I don't know. Question here? What does Venus mean? Venus is a planet, very hot planet. Very hot planet with a greenhouse effect going crazy. Anyone want to explain that better than me? I know I have a lot of strong opinions. I don't know. I don't know if anybody actually knows that, because that probably would have been since.
The U.S. is trying to put together a promotional idea that we should emphasize STE education in the U.S. And it seems like the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics emphasis in our programs will be whatever amount we're spending on it now, I suspect, because it's subcontracted the rest of the well, something or something people is challenging. At least on the surface, that would be a part of it. Or that's
Your question reminds me of a few years ago when President Obama said, "We need a spike." He was trying to use the example of something that pulled the nation together to consolidate and prioritize and spend. And I have a hard time thinking of the other moment in time where something equivalent happened. The changes were massive. The changes to education, the centralization of education, oversight, the creation of NASA, funding for science, taking scientists under the reins of the state in an unprecedented way. All of that happened very, very quickly, very dramatically. It's hard to think of an equivalent to that. Yes.
I've heard it said that usually, so popular media, things that came up with science fiction kind of has led the creation of technology. In your studies of popular media, has there ever been a point where it might go the other way, where it limits what people imagine or what they can do?
Yeah, I think that the rocket is an interesting example because, as you say, there are often sometimes competing representations or competing choices of how to use it. The rocket always fluctuated between a weapon or and a potential station. There's only really one big difference in what we put on top of the ICBMs, whether it was a bomb or human beings. But I think you're absolutely right, though, to point out that technology can be a manifestation of popular hopes. But the problem with the rocket was most of the popular hopes surrounding space travel. But the person who was going to foot the bill was very interested in rockets as weapons, as military weapons. So I'm not sure how I would quantify the evidence of either side, other than knowing that the person in the purse was a lot more interested in how to use those things to defeat the Soviets rather than putting it in the Yes.
President, you mentioned Carl Sagan.
Yes. He was definitely, well, we heard Sagan's voice, right? Sagan was a more successful popularizer than Lay. Sagan was the superstar of the 70s and 80s, but he utilized many of the same tactics, the popular, the romantic motifs, the language about the cosmos, and other types of books. Sagan was also a great debunker. He spent so much of his career just trying to debunk what he considered nonsense. So he is definitely a part of this tradition of science writers and popularizers. And if I went into the 60s and the 70s, he'd probably be the most important person in my time. Yes?
Can you talk a bit about dreams for a new kind of person that might be? It seems like the astronauts, it's not just somebody riding a rocket, but it's supposed to be a very special sort of person.
No, the language that was often used was, it could be evolutionary language. There could be comparisons between, say, amphibians leaping out of the ocean onto the land. It's a moment of amazing evolutionary adaptation in which human beings, through space travel, through the ascent, through leaping into that great unknown, that great new territory, would adapt, would become somehow different, which usually implied better, even though evolution doesn't work that way. But they still thought in terms of the hopeful ascent of mankind. That was the phrase that they often used. Because they compared the leap off of the earth to a leap out of the oceans onto the land as the next great evolutionary event. And everyone would partake. Yes?
You just talked to pretty smart guy. What do you think of the possibility of humans one day becoming
I'm not that smart. I know right now, at light speed, it would still take us 4 years to get to the closest star and 4 years to come back. And the last time I looked at it, I'm totally wrong about this, but I remember reading about how relativity somehow made that where when we get back, everyone would be dead. I don't know how true that is. But as it stands now, it's not very logical to go to Mars. It's not. And Mars, at its closest point, is 28 million miles away. And we can't just immediately send people back. We have to wait 2 years for it to be 28 million miles away again. That doesn't change the fact that I bet many people in this room just feel an instinctual urge that we want to. And we want to send people to Mars, or people to Mars. It's the next logical choice, right? Any other questions? I may be out of time. All right, if anybody's got any questions, I'll be happy to stick around and talk to you personally. Otherwise, thank you very much for